There's this strange sort of paradox when it comes to the middle of any story. Well, I guess it's not really a paradox. Although if you call something a paradox and it isn't a paradox, isn't calling it a paradox technically a... When you think about it, you can take the middle out of any story and go directly from the beginning straight to the ending without really changing the resolution or the conclusion that the story comes to. In this case, you really aren't changing the story, just changing how long it takes. On the flip side of this, you can also take any story and make it take much longer by stretching out how long it takes to get from the beginning to the conclusion. Doing either of these things, though, can result in an unsatisfying story. Jumping right from exposition to the conclusion will make the ending seem unearned. It won't seem like the characters had to struggle to resolve the main conflict of the story. And making things take too long will bore the reader, make the story feel like it's meandering, and require that more information that is not necessary for the story be included. This is what makes the rising action or the middle part of a story much more difficult. The rising action is where you earn your endings. It's where all the stakes and tension of the story get built up before we reach the conclusion. The stakes get raised, conflicts grow more numerous, enemies multiply, characters try and fail, all leading up to the big, exciting conclusion. Rising action is basically everything that happens after the inciting incident, but before the climax and resolution of the story. On the surface, at least, rising action seems pretty simple. You just make things harder and harder for the characters. Despite its simple-sounding nature, the rising action is notoriously difficult to write, and difficult to explain, which is why this video was delayed for a week. As you can probably tell, there's two components to the rising action, the rising part and the action part. When rising action falls flat, it's usually because one of these two components has been missed. Let's start by talking about the rising part. I mentioned during the beginnings video that one of the main purposes of a beginning is to set up the status quo and get the reader invested in the main characters before everything is disrupted by the inciting incident. The reason to start with the status quo is that it generally also means you're starting with a lower level of emotional intensity in the story. This makes getting invested in the characters easier, and it gives more impact to the inciting incident. As the story progresses through the rising action, the emotional intensity, the stakes, the conflict all get higher. Now, this rise doesn't need to be linear, nor does it need to be continuous. You don't want to ramp the intensity of the story up to a 10 too early, the same way you don't want to start with the emotional intensity at a 10. Nor do you want the emotional intensity to stay high for the entirety of the rising action. It's perfectly acceptable for the level of intensity to ebb and flow throughout the middle of the story. You may have an intense scene where things ramp up really high, followed by some calmer, slower moments. These slower moments will give the reader a break and allow you to work in some of the character development and introspection that may need to happen during the rising action, but isn't well suited to happen when the intensity is at a 10. A lot of plot structures represent the rising action as a series of peaks, where the intensity increases then decreases, usually with each subsequent peak being higher than the last one, and ideally the climax being the highest of them all. Now, you might be asking exactly what I mean by emotional intensity, or why I keep referring to it being at a 10, and I really don't have a solid answer for either of those things, except that the emotional intensity is what's rising during the rising action. Emotional intensity basically means the scope and stake of the conflict for the protagonist at any given moment in the story. Throughout the rising action, it's common for the initial conflict to grow in scale, or for more conflicts to arise that weren't necessarily present at the beginning of the story. An increase in the stakes will also increase emotional intensity. The protagonist might make or discover more enemies, or they might rack up more and more failures as they try to solve the conflict, which means they are either running out of chances or running out of ideas. All of these things work together to increase or decrease the emotional intensity of the story. Other terms that you'll see used to refer to this include tension or suspense or the pacing. And while these are all the components of the emotional intensity, I don't think any one of them describes exactly what's going on, and they tend to be distinct concepts. Ultimately, these things, the suspense, the tension, the pacing, all manifest as the action that happens during the rising action. And most of the time, the action of the rising action is precipitated by the protagonist pursuing their main goal. This can either play out through a series of steps that the protagonist needs to take, or as what's known as a try-fail cycle. Like how I tried to get the cat to sit behind me, instead he's sitting in front of me and blocking my script. In the first case, the protagonist lays out a to-do list to resolve the main conflict, the main promise being that once they get through all these steps, they will be able to resolve the main conflict. These could be traveling to a specific location, stealing a specific thing, or defeating a certain enemy. What the steps are and how many of them there are going to vary with the story. Each step in the process should be more difficult or have higher stakes than the last ones, again to ramp up the emotional intensity. This approach to the rising action works best in stories where the protagonist has a clear idea of how to achieve what they need to achieve. Something like a heist is the first thing that came to mind. I've also seen some revenge stories that follow this sort of formula, although the steps in those tend to be a little bit darker. In the aptly named try-fail cycle, it's more a case of trying to solve the conflict and then failing and then trying again, usually with the consequences of each failure and the risks of each attempt increasing over time. How many times the character needs to try before they succeed will depend on the story. Also, the last thing that they try doesn't need to be the only thing that succeeds. You can have them try something, have it succeed, but still not resolve the main plot, either because the stakes have been raised, or the conflict has grown, or something else has changed that the character wasn't aware of. You can also combine both approaches, say by making a mini try-fail cycle in each step of the to-do list. So the character might have to try 2 or 3 different things in order to accomplish step 1 or step whatever of the to-do list. A lot of different plot structures will give you specific numbers around how many try-fail cycles there should be, or I would say use those things as a guideline, but don't be afraid to deviate from them if it works better for your story. Just remember that every action the character takes should be to further their goal, and that goal should be ultimately related to the main conflict. And all of this stuff should have been established in the beginning and set into motion by the inciting incident, blah, blah, blah. Now, there are other aspects of the story that need to be addressed during the rising action as well. Character relationships, character development, subplots, exposition, all of that needs to be woven in among the events that relate to the main plot. I've talked about, I think, all of those elements in previous videos, but one of the main advantages of having the lulls in the rising action is it gives you an opportunity to work on secondary elements of the story. Some of which would be difficult to do if the emotional intensity of the story was always at a 10. Although if it's above a 7, some of them... I don't know why I didn't just say high emotional intensity. That would have been way easier than making up this scale. Okay, wow, I've been talking for like 10 minutes and I don't feel like I've said anything. Rising action is a tricky thing to pin down because it is so variable from story to story and also makes up the bulk of most stories. There isn't as much concrete advice I can give you about the rising action like I can about beginnings or about endings. If I had mastered how to write the middle and how to write the rising action, I probably would be able to give you more concrete advice, but I haven't done that yet, so you'll have to settle for what's in this video. Next week, we'll continue our discussion on plotting by talking about the end of a plot, the endings. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.